good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I'm really happy to be here. I'm currently the director of the Commonwealth Cyber Initiative and the Bradley Professor of Cybersecurity at Virginia Tech. And it's an enormous pleasure for me to introduce Linda Doyle, because we've been friends for ages. And Linda was the person who first invited me to go to Ireland. And I ended up staying there for 10 years after that. So that says something about the country and the power of Linda as a colleague and as a friend. So Linda was the director of Connect, which is the Science Foundation Ireland funded National Research Center on Future Networks. Then when she stepped down from that role, she became the Vice President of Research for Trinity College Dublin. She is a huge advocate for spectrum management changes, so changes in the way that we manage spectrum, and she's currently the chair of the Ofcom Spectrum Advisory Board. A unique thing about Linda is that her expertise also extends to the creative arts practices. So she is the professor of engineering and the arts at Trinity College. She's also the chair of the board for the Douglas Hyde Gallery in Dublin. She's also the director of two startups that started with Connect, SRS and Accelerate. So she has a huge and diverse resume. Every time that I listen to Linda, I'm both surprised and inspired. So I'm really looking forward to your talk. So you have the floor, Linda.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm just going to do share screen and can everybody see?
Yes, you can see it.
Okay, thank you very much. Luis, thank you very much for the lovely introduction, and we miss you very much in Dublin and wish you were still here. Wish we had the power to keep you here longer than 10 years. And thank you very much also to Vincent Chan for asking me to do this keynote. So it's actually a real treat, because in my current role, I actually don't at the moment get to talk about things engineering as much as I would like. So before I start, I just want to say that I am sorry, like Brendan, that we weren't able to personally greet people here. This is a picture of Front Square in Trinity when we had an installation there, and in the installation you see Samuel Beckett, a past student, and Leah Kenny, a current student who studies Beckett. And it's a picture I really love, so I put that up there. It is an awful pity we weren't able to meet, but the conference seems to be going hugely successfully, and I believe there's well over 2,000 people registered for it. So while being online is second best, it's still great that it's gone ahead, and there's been so many wonderful speakers, and I very much enjoyed Max's talk just now as well. So you know, sometimes when you get asked to do a keynote, you kind of think about the things you know. And sometimes I can be a little bit silly and think about, oh, well, I'd like to use the keynote to think about the future and maybe some of the things I don't know enough of. And in fact, that's what I want to do today. And I want to look a little bit beyond 5G and ask the question, what should that look like? And I know there have been plenty of people this week who've been looking at that, but I want to suggest a different way forward. And what I'm suggesting is this idea of 0G. So I want to try and persuade you all that you should think about a thing called 0G, whatever that is. So your immediate reaction might be, sorry, just 1 second, might be, what a Luddite. I'm totally against any kind of progress. I'm talking about going backwards. I'm not interested in technological progress, and that would be completely far from the truth. I think all of the ideas that are coming up at ICC are just so interesting. And I suppose I want to say to people, I'm not talking about going back to the 1980s. This is not what I see 0G as. I see it as going forward in a very different way. And what I'm asking people to do really is to kind of press the reset button and to maybe stand back a bit and to think about what kind of world that we want going forward. And, you know, when I was thinking about this keynote, I think it's a very opportune time for us to say, okay, where are we now and where would we like to go? And to ask that question technically, to ask that question in the context of ICC and to ask that question in the context of engineers, as engineers, computer scientists, physicists working in the area of communications. And the reason, and I suppose it will probably come as no surprise to people, that the reason I think now is a very good time are very, very obvious reasons. You know, so the first of that is of course related to the pandemic. On the one hand, you could say, scary and difficult as the pandemic has been, that the pandemic has been brilliant for networks and connectivity. And to a certain extent, it's really, really, really showcased why connectivity, being online and being interconnected is so important. Of course, in showcasing that, that's also exacerbated the digital divide, and I've been on other panels in ICC where that's come up. I think a key thing has come out of it is that while technology has been a huge help, it's not the full solution. That I think we get a better sense of how the social, cultural and technical all matter. And I think a really, really good reason why it is to kind of reflect and think is because we are hitting a big recession and we have to understand what a recovery would look like and where we would go next. So coupled with that, the world is at a very crucial juncture due to climate change. There's extreme climate justice issues highlighting inequalities even more. The younger generation, I think, are leaving us in the pale place by demanding better of us for them. And essentially, I think we have no choice but to kind of pause, take breath, and, you know, think where we want to go. So what I'd hope to do in this talk is to persuade to you that we should look at zero G. And what I mean by zero G, I'm kind of evolving and developing. So you could say it could be something about doing zero harm. It could be about a carbon neutral footprint. It could be about thinking about more than technology. But I've kind of been working through what I think the ideas are. And for the moment, I think it's based around these four things. So I'm going to talk about making a material difference, using what I call a new systems theory, doing more with less, and driving a new economy. And I'd be really interested to hear what people think. So making a material difference. I mean, this actually is very much what it sounds. It's making telecommunication systems, materials and resources which are sustainable. And this is a really, really tall order. I don't know whether people are aware, but last year was the year of the periodic table. We actually had various celebrations in Trinity. This is one of another building in Trinity where there was a periodic table night, and this happened around the world. And many people may have seen this. I think it's a very lovely version of the periodic table, but it very much produced last year to emphasize elements that were limited availability, or there was a rising threat to, or going to be in short supply over the future. So I think that really got me thinking, and I've been thinking about this a lot in the last while. And of course, I suppose it's really, really well known that a mobile phone contains a huge number of naturally occurring elements, including ones that are under rising threat from increased use. So in thinking through this and thinking about this and looking at the work that's been done in this area, I'm influenced by, I suppose, a very, very wide range of kind of sources. So one of the people I'm quite influenced by is a guy called Jussi Parikka. And he has this very nice book called An Ecology of Media. And he looks at all of the media and technologies we use in a much, much different way than we do as engineers and computer scientists. And in this particular thing, he relates the media to the kind of to the geology of the earth and tracks the chemicals and metals and minerals that were in our media. So I find he came to Trinity a number of years ago and gave a very, very compelling talk about his work. So find the way he thinks really, really interesting. And you see that way reflected in the next thing I want to show you, which is currently, I've been using this in a few presentations, but it's one of my favorite pieces of art that I've seen in a long while. So you won't be able to see it fully from looking at this. This is the complete vision. If you were looking at this in real life, it's an enormous piece of work that is usually in a museum or art gallery. And it's called Anatomy of an AI System. And what Kate Crawford and Vladan Joler have done is they've taken the Amazon Echo and they've broken down every single bit of it, every element that's in it, every piece of work that goes into it, how it's trained, the work that's done professionally, the work that's done kind of maybe a little bit more invisibly. And it's an amazing, I just think it's beautiful to look at. and it's amazing to explore. And there's an essay that goes with it, and there's a couple of things that they bring out in the essay, and I just have some of the comments here. You know, so they talk about each object of in an extended AI system, from network routers to batteries to microphones, is built using elements that require billions of years to produce. And I think it's really powerful the way they express that. And they really talk about time in an interesting way. And they say, looking from the perspective of deep time, we are extracting Earth's history to serve a split second of technological time in order to build devices that are often designed to be used for no more than a few years. And I think this juxtaposition of these timelines is really, really interesting. So the essay is very, very beautiful, and I'd recommend that people would read it. And I've just zoomed into a number of points here, and they too bring out this thing of using Earth's resources, and you'll see how we have used more rare Earth elements over time. And in a single iPhone, there's 75 different elements, and that the current citizen uses way more than in the last century. You know, the kinds of things that we know. And if you zoom in other bits, they also go into the detail of what's involved in extracting those elements from the Earth. So what they do is they paint a really powerful picture, Yossi Parika and many, many others, of, I suppose, the supply chain and what happens along that supply chain in developing the materials for all of the media that we use. So if you look around the world and you ask what's been done in this, there's a number of different examples. One of the one that I find very powerful at the moment comes from a company called Fairphone. And Fairphone actually, you know, tries to live by a set of principles that allows us to create more sustainable devices. So as this diagram shows, at a very simple level, you're able to take this apart and fix it. They focus on recycling, but they also focus on the supply chain and how sustainable that is. And I was really struck when I looked at one of the projects they did through the EIT raw materials kick and with other companies, that even in just taking one element where they looked at tin, there were so many different nuances and understanding how they could actually source that and use that in a sustainable way, that it's really, really, it gives you a really deep understanding of the depth of complexity that is involved in even aiming to do something sustainable. There's many other projects that they've done, and this is very, very interesting, where they look at all the different materials in a phone. I've just blown up the headlines there, where they look at, you know, whether it can be recycled, the estimated depletion rates, its association with water or soil pollution, and they rate all of the elements. And they've done a lot of work where they take each of these and they dig further and they check whether there's potential for you to do different and new things. And I've just put up one of the, this is about cobalt, and it's from one of their reports, and where they look at how sustainable it is and where does it come from, and really, really dig deep. So I think the whole point of this is to just give you a sense that, you know, making a simple statement like, I want to look at the materials at which telecommunication systems are made from, and I want to move towards a place where they're sustainable, is hugely and utterly complex. And just like our networks, I suppose, are connect the universe and connect us in so many different ways, this is a highly intricate web of how we're doing things, of the way things work. And you really need to get into all aspects of that web to really, I suppose, make progress and change. There's also other ways of doing it, and I came across this interesting paper where it looked at whether you could actually take the materials that were really rare and you could use advances in material science to actually replace them. So in this paper that I've referenced here, it's by a group of researchers in Chalmers, and they study different metals, and then they look at nanomaterials based on carbon. And carbon is in abundance, and they look at things like graphene and carbon nanotubes, and they've asked the question, is it possible to take these materials that we see in phones and use alternative materials that are made from things that are more available? And it's really, really interesting. They've found 14 different metals where there's potential, and there's a lot more work to do in this area. There's also a lot more work to think about, and when we design things, how we actually stop using particular things and I suppose just don't use metals in the first place. So bringing this section to a close and taking a material difference, it is without a doubt that if we wanted to look forward and create a zero-G that we felt was about sustainable materials, that it is exceptionally complex. It really does upend how we do business. It requires enormous transparency and enormous cooperation. And you'd have to ask, you know, can the world cope with that? But I do think it's a noble goal. And it would be interesting to think that something we're talking about in the future would be synonymous with kind of sustainability. And I think it also throws up many issues around what does it mean to talk about the physical layer. I know the physical layer has a very specific meaning for us in an ICC and in ComSoc, but I think the physicality of objects need to increasingly feature in our discussion. So that's the first thing. So the second element of zero G for me is using a new systems theory. And what I mean by this is I want to take a systems approach to thinking about how telecommunications infrastructure sits within the built and natural environment. So I'm just going to take a little while to explain this and come at this from a few different angles. Essentially, when we create infrastructure, and especially if you look at 5G, I mean, the infrastructure penetrates the city, is on every piece of street furniture, and we also have infrastructure, obviously, in rural areas. So I want to think about that more, I suppose, holistically. So what I don't mean is the following. I came across this very funny picture of a fake tree and antenna. So I'm not talking about thinking about how infrastructure and the natural and physical world come together because we want to hide things. I want to stand back and ask things a little bit more systematically. So what I mean is something like this. So this is a very inspiring piece of work by an architect called Claire Lister and Alex Saavedra. And they actually are using basically a big large hole in the ground for a data center that heats water, that's a public resource as well. And they have this kind of architecture of ecology where they think kind of more holistically. So this kind of hints at the kind of thing I'm thinking of. And another interesting example, I came across this young researcher in Trinity called Ian Donoghue. Now he's working actually, as it turns out, on wind turbines. And he comes from a biodiversity background. And rather than think of the wind turbine as something you just plonk on a landscape, he thinks of the landscape completely. And he thinks about the opportunities for carbon sequestration, pollination, wildlife biodiversity, et cetera, and looks at all of it holistically together. And he makes really, really strong arguments about how you can design a system, the system being the wind turbine and the land and the space it's in, that actually has mitigation options for species, habitat, stability, etc. And I think this kind of systematic way of thinking is very, very interesting and something that doesn't currently exist when we think of telecommunications infrastructure, whether that be in the city or whether it be in rural areas. So to stress the point further, what I thought I would do is I would take a little step backwards. And I know people are probably going to think I'm about to overthrow capitalism at this point, but I'll just give the next example. So this is a very, very interesting cyberneticist called Stafford. And Stafford was popular. He worked in the 1970s, and the diagram on the right hand side is called from a book called The Brain of the Firm. And Stafford, I think, very, very interesting character, but one of the most interesting projects that he did in Chile. And Allende actually, together with an engineer called Fernando Flores, invited him to Chile to help them manage Chile's economy. And he created this project called Cybersyn. And what you see on the left-hand side there is the control room that was created in Chile to manage completely the economy of Chile. And 99% Invisible is one of my most favorite podcasts, and there is a fantastic episode of 99% Invisible about this if anyone wants to go to listen to it and hear a bit more. But what's really, really striking about his project, and I've taken out these points from a really interesting paper about it, is that Stafford Beer, if you look at the points that were in his system, I'll just go through them a little bit. So first of all, he had a thing called Cyberstride. It was a system to collect performance indicators from production plants. He had a thing called CyberNet, which is about communicating with everybody. And he was talking about communicating with individuals, with companies, with government, with everybody. He had a thing called, I think, Checo, which is some kind of model to model the Chilean economy. And then he had the operations room that I just showed you. And they were trying to do all of this. And I believe there were only 2 computers in Chile at the time, and they were using lots of telex machines. But what you actually really have here is an Internet of Things explanation, where you want to get information from something, you want to control it in some kind of productive way, and you want to kind of take action. Except what we have here is somebody trying to do this in a much wider sense, where you're not just thinking about the technical elements that we normally talk about, but you're thinking of the kind of wider landscape, you're thinking about the wider society, and you're kind of working from that perspective. So what I want to conclude from this is that I'm not suggesting, because I don't think, and you know, it's no surprise that the Cybersyn never took off. I'm not suggesting we completely model telecoms infrastructure, nature and society. In fact, actually, lots of times when I feel engineers or computer scientists or mathematicians suggest that we can model everything or suggest we can model emotions, I would be very, very skeptical of that. But I am suggesting that we need to move to a more holistic way of thinking about how we conceptualize and design telecoms infrastructure. And I am suggesting that we need to bring different disciplines into that mix. And that's exactly what I mean by a new systems theory, that the systems go beyond the telecommunications networks that we know and increasingly edge into the other spaces and think more holistically about that. And the Stafford beer, I suppose I was using it provocatively to say, okay, here was a way of thinking. And can we even use some of that to think about how we think about telecommunication systems going forward? So that's the second element of zero G. The third element of zero G is about doing more with less and focusing on making more with less resources and especially less data, is I suppose what I want to say here. So we've all done here in this conference, and there are many, many papers that exist already, and there's many projects in the past like Green Touch, where there's been huge focus on how we do more with less, how we reduce energy consumption. I couldn't pass up putting in a spectrum reference, because you know you can't have a presentation without a picture of this in it, as we all know if you're into spectrum. I mean, my entire interest in dynamic spectrum access and spectrum management is all about something that is a scarce resource and making it go round more, making more out of the resource by treating it as dynamically and you know and working with it that way. So as engineers and computer scientists and researchers, this is often what it's about. And again, as I said, there's just tons of papers that could fall under this heading in this conference. But I think where we're at now is very much about doing more with less data. And this is really, really challenging. And even when I was listening to Max's talk just before mine, and the types of applications he was talking about in the 5G space and the way they use data, I think we need to think very, very seriously about this. Now, I'm hugely influenced by a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism by Shoshana Zuboff, and many people here will know this book. And this term, surveillance capitalism, I suppose she introduced it in 2014. But it's garnered, I suppose, a lot more chat and discussion in the last years. And I've just put down a few points about surveillance capitalism here for people who might not be familiar with the term. So, you know, she talks about surveillance capitalism unilaterally claiming human experience as free raw material, you know, for translation into behavioral data and creation of, often without our explicit consent, new products. And I think this is really, really, really important. And surveillance capitalism, it draws attention to different things. I mean, it really, really, I suppose, makes the point that data is gathered in exchange for services we get. You know, it is not free to Google something. You're actually exchanging. Your currency is the data. It seeks to draw attention to the fact that the data gathering happens at a massive scale and at a systematic scale. And for things that we're not aware of. And many people here will be familiar with this in the context of elections and the manipulation of data and the understanding of kind of the patterns of behavior we have in order to kind of influence us to vote in particular ways. So I think a lot of the challenge around understanding the data that has been gathered about people and the scale at which it's been gathered at. There is a kind of growing awareness of this. And if you look at even the COVID-19 situation and the track and trace, I suppose, discussions that are happening, a lot of those are influenced by people's attitude to data, even if they know that ultimately there's something kind of good that could come out of a track and trace system. So I think we really do need to think about the amounts of data we're gathering. You do see lots of research now where people are looking at AI and actually trying to use AI techniques that require less data. I just put a few here. It's no means the case that these people are necessarily motivated by the same reason I am, by the surveillance capitalism. They can be motivated by many, many other reasons. But here, for example, there's a catch-ba technique that's able to use you know, that by comparison, if you use a convolutional neural network, you need 50,000 more larger data set. So you see this everywhere. You see great examples of how, you know, robots can use, can learn from generalized, can learn to generalize from a few small examples. And there's opportunities in many, many areas where machine learning is applied, not least because oftentimes people don't have the data sets they want, but also motivated very much by this kind of questioning of the data that we give up and issues around privacy. So the conclusion I draw from that is doing more with less is a natural part of everything we do, but more with less data is needed more than ever. And given that data is such a currency in the world that we use, this also really upends the world we're in and is majorly disruptive. And if we are going this route, if zero G is going to be about this, or if I can persuade you that it should, you know, there's a lot to look at. So the final, the fourth element of the zero G is what I've called driving a new economy. And I've labeled this an industrial, technological, ethical, and ecological revolution. I came across, and you'll see, I suppose through this, I have used some art examples, and here's another one. I came across this, this little installation, and it's called Welcome to the Museum of the Fossilized Internet. And I'm going to read out some of the things that are written here in case people can't see them. And it says, the museum was founded in 2050 to commemorate 2 decades of a fossil-free internet and to invite museums visitors to experience the coal and oil-powered internet of 2020. Gasp at the horrors of surveillance capitalism, nod knowingly at the plague of spam, be baffled at the size of AI training data, and lament the binge culture of video streaming. And I think it's a really, really interesting way to kind of put yourself into the future and to kind of look back and to question, what are we doing now? So I bring that up in that context. The way I kind of am looking at things at the moment, we're at the 4th industrial revolution. And when you look at all of those industrial revolutions, even though the 4th one attempts to a certain extent to bring the human into the space and thinks about the human, and even though the 4th industrial revolution includes the kind of Internet of Things, and you see the embedding of instruments in the environment around it, so we better understand it, it still is very industry oriented. And that's what I really mean by you know, I suppose going further and pushing towards this industrial, technological, ethical, and ecological revolution. So a question I think that'll pop up when I say that is the following, and I thought this was a funny newspaper about Theresa May, where they asked, was she desperate, deluded, and doomed? And I'm sure that many people listening to this could ask me the same. Am I desperate, deluded, and doomed to think that the kinds of things that I'm bringing up here, which very much challenge how we build networks, the materials we use, how we use data, and thereby challenge everything that the economy is based on, is this a completely stupid idea? So I want to try and answer that in the last few slides. And the first thing I would say with that is, if you look around the world at the moment, you see many people interested in this notion of ESG. So ESG is this thing called environmental, social, and governance. And basically what happens in this context, these are a set of criteria that companies can, and metrics have been developed so a company can say how good they essentially are at ESG. And there's lots of interesting things to read. Here's one that was developed by a particular company, and they actually created a kind of ESG understanding in the context of sustainable development goals. And companies are able to get rated on this basis. So I thought it would be good to quote the Financial Times as a reference here. And I read a really interesting article actually during the week about how ESG passes the COVID challenge. And the point that they're making in this article is that a lot of companies got a boost in investment because they scored well on this ESG level. And people would have expected those kinds of companies to not continue to do well in a global pandemic, recession, or where things were challenged. And in fact, actually, they're appearing to do really, really well. And the ESG labeling has not actually lost its kind of, I suppose, attractiveness. Now, the article also, like any good article, points out the things that are challenging about ESG. And I think it's good to read that. But ultimately, I think what it's saying is that even in a traditional world of stocks and shares of investment, that the kind of notion that something is striving to have better environmental, societal, and governance type behavior matters. There's also a lot of carrots to play for. You'll also see things like the European Green Deal investment plan that is really, really pushing a kind of new way of doing things and kind of new, I suppose, new businesses, a new green economy. And things like the just transition mechanism, which is all about making sure that when you actually change your behavior and move, I suppose, into a different way of doing things and might be penalized, that there's a way of kind of helping that in that context as well. So, and of course, there is the voice, I suppose, from the younger generation asking us and pleading with us and begging us to make sure we're not destroying their future. So, my conclusion on this bit is that I'm not saying ESG is the way to go, this ESG labeling, or that it's without flaws, or that it can't be manipulated by people to get what they want. But I am saying that the fact that people actually use ESG metrics to influence investment shows that a zero-G concept could have a future, even within conventional markets, even though I also think there's plenty more for us to think about in the circular economy and in terms of moving to new directions. So I'm very nearly coming to the end of this. I just have a small few more points to make. I thought I might just briefly say what we kind of in Trinity are trying to do in response to this kind of an approach, not to do with telecom specifically, but just to mention. So we are currently working on what we call the Grand Canal Innovation District, which is developing a part of our campus, which for us is in the heart of what we call the Silicon Docks in Dublin. So in Dublin, there's lots of companies from around the world, lots of multinationals, lots of headquarters, and part of Trinity is based in the centre of one of these districts. And our plan is to build this out and to develop this whole district. And at the centre of this district, one of the things we're planning is a new research institute that would kind of drive a lot of the, I suppose, innovation and the collaboration and the deep partnership of that might happen there. And that institute, and I just have one slide on this, is called the Engineering, Environment and Emerging Technologies Institute. And it's very much based on this whole idea that we can make technical progress. We can focus on the next generation of whatever technical areas we're looking at, while at the same time not destroying the natural capital of the world. We understand that the natural capital delivers ecosystems, goods and services that keep economic activity going. But we also understand that economic activity and how society thrives can have impact back on natural capital. And what we're doing here is we're trying to, I suppose, cut the divides between some of the areas that I spoke to you before. So one of the things we're doing, we're bringing researchers from natural sciences, from zoology and botany, together with engineers and computer scientists and social sciences. We're taking a challenge-based approach where we look at problems from a challenge perspective. We're working in deep partnership, and we're creating a lot of shared resources that industry, academia and others can use. And that's our attempt, I suppose, to break down the barriers between what we and what I've maybe described here are kind of slightly different worlds that need to come together more. So then just to summarize, I think the way I've described zero-G, or my version of zero-G here, is daunting. There's probably many people here who think that doesn't make any sense, or who might not agree with the proposition or where we're going. I think though, even if you don't agree with the proposition, I think it's really time for us not to let 6G just be everything we promised in 5G and didn't get around to delivering, plus a few more things. So even if you hate or disagree or contest anything in the proposition of 0G, I think it would be really, really good to think, what do we really want from the next generation? I think the other thing that I think is really, really important is, and it's something that I struggle to fully understand how we can cope with. So it's really important that we continue to have engineers and computer scientists and physicists who are all good at those disciplines. But increasingly, it's the case that the kinds of challenges we face are so complex and require so much different input that I think it asks us to question where we are, and where we are as a communication society, where we are as a group of people interested in communications. And the kind of additional input we need, from my perspective, can't be tagged onto the end. It has to be integral. So thank you very much for listening. If anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer. If they want to get in contact, I'm happy with that too. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. As I mentioned in the introduction, you, as I expected, you inspired me and surprised me at the same time, as usual. We have a few questions, and then starting from this question of how do we get there, right? So this is a call to arms, and you addressed a little bit of that, but there may not be the financial incentives for telecom operators, for example, to go in that direction. There's a lot of inertia towards 6G being what you described that it shouldn't be. So do we need more regulation, or is what are the stakes to get us to 0G?
So it's, I mean, that's a very hard question, and I think it's complicated, and I also think it's different in different parts of the world. I think there's a kind of different European view, than there might be a US view, than there might be an Asian view. So, I mean, the view in Europe is very much that they try to incentivize it by, you know, ensuring that, for example, when Horizon Europe, the framework that follows Horizon 2020, is very, very much focused on things like this, and it hopes to incentivize, I'm not saying 0G specifically, but hopes to incentivize this kind of behavior in the kinds of research that it supports, and in kind of the funds that it has for the green economy. I certainly don't think, I certainly don't think people will do this if they can get away with not doing it. So I do think increasingly there has to be a bit of a regulation role in this as well. If you read, I mean, I suppose I would say I am a disgrace myself, in the sense that I haven't bought a fair phone yet. But if you do read, and deeply read, the practices that lead to the material goods, or the phones and devices we have now, we should all, that should be enough to make us take action, but it doesn't. So I think regulation will also be needed as well.
And you mentioned during your talk that maybe the audience was might disagree with some of this, but so I'm going to share with you something that was shared only with the panelists by one of our audience members, who said, "Goodness, we need more women in engineering and sciences to save men from self-destruction." So that's so that you know the kind of reaction that you're engendering. There was also a question about the pandemic. So isn't the lesson of the pandemic that data usage is exploding for more services, that we may indeed need 10 times more data rather than less?
So that's a very good question, and it is a double-edged sword. So I fully believe, for example, you know, in personalized medicine, that the more information you get about more people, that the more precise diagnosis you can make, and, you know, individual treatments that you can get. So it is challenging. I think what has to stop happening is, without a doubt, the use of your data without any awareness of what it's going to be used for. I think that happens through numerous different ways. It happens through education and greater awareness. And, you know, the phrase surveillance capitalism is now a much more common usage phrase than it had been. So those kind of things help. But it also happens through technology, and through technology, you know, controlling the use of data. I think the challenge is, and I know Declan is on the panel as well, but the challenge is, so if you look across the world, the areas in the world that are tighter about data, where, for example, GDPR exists, which I actually happen to think GDPR ultimately has a lot of good in it, are the ones that sometimes then end up innovating less because they don't have the freedom in areas where people, I suppose, are allowed to take more liberties with data. And I think we do actually have to get that right. You know, it's a tricky question. So I certainly think, I mean, I suppose for me, and maybe there is no way around this, because you can't say you can only, I mean, creativity and innovation comes by people appropriating things. But for me, for example, I wouldn't want to give up all of my personal data to have a better shopping experience, but I would be interested in it in the context of a medical experience. And we don't currently have a way of being able to say yes or no to that kind of thing, and we should. And I think there are technical solutions there as well.
Okay. I wanted to touch on this cross-disciplinary aspects of what it gets to get to 0G, and there was a question around that. So the question was, what are some of the skills, the cross-disciplinary skills that are needed to get there? And I'm going to augment that question with, we've been talking about multidisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity for a while. And I think it's more and more clear that we need it. And again, how do we get to that as a scientific community?
So I think so. I have a couple of suggestions, and I'm sure there are many more. So if you look at the IEEE, let's just take that as an example. So the IEEE has a publication of, you know, Engineering and Society, or I might have the wrong name of it there, but it's something separate. It's something over there. It's not something that's part. And I certainly know that Vincent Chan's plan for ComSAC is to integrate things more. And I think that is really, really powerful. So first of all, things can't always be separate. However, the big challenge is that it's very hard. You can't have everybody. Like, I sometimes think, you know, I'm a jack of all trades and I'm a master of nothing, because I have an interest in a wide range of things. And this is the challenge with this always. How do we still have the deep skill and the deep knowledge that we have, and at the same time have the breadth that I think is needed for the future of communication systems? I'd say there's no shortcut to spending time with people from different disciplines. There's no shortcut to that having to be informal as well as formally organized. And I think some of it might mean you'd say, okay, what should other societies in the IEEE look like going forward? Or should there be something else in ComSoc that allows this kind of thinking in more systematically? And maybe I'll add one other thing. So I used to be very involved in IEEE DICEBAN, and that brought together regulation and technology. And I really liked it at the beginning because sessions had both regulation and technology in it, we'll say the mainstream sessions. But then what would happen is they'd split into two, and all the regulatory people would go into one and all the technical people would go into the other. And they wouldn't be talking to each other enough when they were both in their separate sessions. So I think you actually have to orchestrate the coming together of the different disciplines much more constructively, much more formally, much more regularly, if you want the kind of dialogue to happen. And you also have to, I think, work on how people speak, the vocabulary they use, and how they understand each other.
Okay. Maybe one very quick last question from the audience. Do you think that making wireless networks more intelligent, so embedding more AI, will actually worsen their environmental footprint?
Not necessarily. So I think there are lots of examples. So when people talk about smart homes or smart anything or smart cities first, there's always an environmental bit in it, and there's an AI bit in that as well. However, what I think will worsen it is if you go away in your own box as an engineer and you come up with an AI solution and you've never spoken to somebody who's an environmental scientist or who is a botanist or who is from a different discipline, and only at the end you go over to that person and say, look what I've done. I think that'll worsen it. But if you actually from the beginning kind of understand, because I think there's all sorts of really powerful things that AI can do, and if you understand the root of the problem more clearly and the various impacts, AI can do what we want it to do. And it reminds me, I was on the Synergy panel with Vincent, and it is, you know, it is about different voices working together. We were talking there about industry and academia coming together, but it is about the different voices listening to each other at the right time in the research process, not at the end. And I suppose that's what I would say. So AI has huge amount to offer, but we need to think through it more holistically.
Thank you very much, Linda. We have more questions, but we're out of time. I'm not going to offer, like Brandon usually does, to take you out for a glass of Guinness, because I know you don't like it, but maybe next time I see you, we'll have a cup of hot water.
I usually go bright red in front of an audience when I'm giving a talk, and I've now discovered even when I can only see 5 people, I still go bright red. So I have the experience of feeling like I'm talking to loads of people, one way or the other. So thank you very much, Louise, and thank you for listening to me, everybody.
Thanks, Linda, and back